This time we'll look at 10 of the very best V-twin motorcycles. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. It is said that Indian created the first V-twin motorcycle in 1907. The engine layout has been around in various configurations ever since. So here are 10 of the very best V-twin motorcycles. Moto Guzzi's small block engines. Although sometimes referred to as transverse V-twins, because the cylinders stick out either side, it's probably more correct to term these engines in line, because in fact their crankshaft runs along the line of the motorcycle, and no one refers to a Ford Mustang as a transverse V8. The design in fact dates back all the way to 1902 in the Motor Carden, although AGS built them during the 1930s, and Indian also built them in the late 30s and early 40s, although one of the most effective early uses was in the German Victoria of the 1950s. The first Guzzis to use the layout appeared in the 1960s, although it was the much later small block engines which we're talking about here. These were designed by Lino Tonti and were ground up redesign of the earlier models, featuring from the start an easy to remove oil filter, heron heads, and a much smaller, more compact design, and a completely different chassis too. The machines first appeared in the late 70s, initially as a 350, quickly followed by a 500. They were available in sporty and cooking flavours, and while lacking the power and all-out torque of their bigger brothers, the bikes were much more nimble and a great fun to ride. Fuel consumption was excellent from the heron head, and generally these bikes are pretty reliable. By the standards of the time, these bikes can feel surprisingly refined, and the brakes are pretty good too. Over the years the bikes have become increasingly large, first moving from 350 to 500, then moving on to 650 and eventually the 750 types that ran until the end of the heron head design. The V7-2 being the last of the bikes to use a heron head before a more conventional head was adapted on the Mark IIIs. But when you ride one of the early bikes alongside the later V7s, the lineage is very clear. And I think the fact that these bikes have been on sale for so long proves the general sturdiness of the all-round design. These are great character for little bikes and are well worth a ride out. The Suzuki SV 650. It's hard to think that the SV has actually been around since 1999, and although it could be argued it's had more facelifts than Madonna, the beating heart of this little machine, its 90-degree V-twin 70-odd horsepower engine, has changed very little. These days of course it's gained fuel injection, traction control and a few other niceties, but the engine itself has the same old soul. It produces good power across a good broad range, particularly around the mid-range and top end, revs well, and feels kinda like you're buying a cheap Ducati. And that's not an insult, that's a good thing, because the bike undercuts those bikes by quite a bit. Particularly when you look at the latest naked models, they're very reminiscent of latter model Ducati Monsters, aren't they? Initially the bike was available as the Sporty S and the naked model, but as the market moved towards big litre capacity sports bikes, the S model faded from use and the naked model is the only one we're left with today. You may wonder why I didn't include the larger TL or SV1000 models, but the fact is this bike has been the biggest seller and it's the one that's continued to sell for a much longer period than either of its larger contemporaries, and that's probably because it gives riders what they actually need and no more. Do we actually need more than 70 horsepower? Many riders will claim yes they do, but in fact 130 miles an hour, and it's even proved a popular amount over the years for track riders too, because it delivers sufficient controllable power. And that's the great thing about the bike, it's user friendly, it's ideal for a novice and yet has just enough power to keep any sane experienced rider interested in the general ride. It makes use of fairly cheap suspension units but somehow manages to handle and steer very nicely, which is probably the key to this machine. It makes the most of everything that it's got, it makes the most of its power, it makes the most of its chassis components and delivers a very enjoyable machine which has a level of character which you don't normally find on a Japanese motorcycle. The SV as a bike is probably soon to go out of production, but it is one that will be missed very much by the riders who've owned them either now or in the past. A great little all-round, economical package. The Harley-Davidson Knucklehead. Today when we think of Harley-Davidsons, we think of lumbering, overweight, poor ground clearance, massive motorcycles with zero sporting potential. But of course it wasn't always that way. At one time Harley-Davidson were a big player in the world of racing. So named after its unusually styled rocker covers, the Knucklehead was introduced in 1936 as a replacement for the side valve VL models, and was their first engine, at least for road use, to use overhead valves. Of course, overhead valves were nothing new, but this was the first time that it was available on the Harley-Davidson that was not intended for racing. Though of course, given the performance potential of the overhead valve engine, many were raced. The overhead valve motor represented a major leap forward in terms of performance, and gave the Knucklehead near 100 mph top speeds. After some initial teething problems, the engine would become a great success, and would really make Harley-Davidson in the years leading up to World War II. And it was at this point that major competitors Indian began to fall behind, because they never did develop an overhead valve engine for production purposes. Knucklehead production would continue until 1947, and in 1948 it was replaced by the panhead engine. The Indian Chief. The Indian Motorcycle Company lay claim to producing the first V-twin motorcycle in general production from 1907. This is usually contested by other European manufacturers, but the fact is it is the first V-twin produced in America, predating Harley by a number of years. At the time of the introduction of the Indian Chief in 1922, Indian could claim to be the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. Although the company did quite well from manufacturing machines for the military in the First World War, between the wars and during World War II, they were less successful. This was not helped by the introduction of the Knucklehead from Harley-Davidson. Indian simply did not follow suit and introduce an overhead valve engine. Instead they stuck to their massive side valves, which although smooth and refined, could not match the absolute performance potential of the overhead valve motors. Post World War II, Indian fell increasingly behind Harley-Davidson, and problematically, the Chief would stay in production until 1953 and continued to use a side valve layout, even though by that time it was considered very much outdated. Indian would go on to develop an overhead valve motor, but this unusually was a parallel twin, very much influenced by the British manufacturers of the day. And unfortunately, financial constraints and the problems associated with developing an all-new engine design meant that the company went under. There then followed an unfortunate period where the Indian name was attached to machines produced outside of America, before the company would be completely reborn in the early 2000s. The Ducati Monster. The Ducati Monster is essentially a parts bin special, using parts from the 851 Sportster with the air-cooled engine from the more humble Roadsters slotted into the frame and given an all-new restyling. The guy Galuzzi had come up with the idea in the early 90s and tried to sell it to the company heads, who, to be perfectly frank, weren't remotely interested. Famously, Galuzzi took some parts home and constructed the first bike himself, before showing it off to the company heads, who remained not completely convinced about the merits of the design. But when he showed it off to Ducati fans, he got a very positive reaction. The Ducati management began to see the logic of the design, and eventually in 1993 the first Monster was introduced, complete with a 900cc engine from the 900 SS. Now you may wonder why I've included the Monster here and not something like the 916 or the 748 or any of the fantastic sports bikes that arrived thereafter. But the fact is, it is the Monster that made all these motorcycles possible. Its sales were phenomenal, and the reason that Ducati is the company it is today can largely be placed on the shoulders of the humble little Monster. So in fact it could be reasonably argued that the Monster is the most important Ducati ever built. Without the Monster, none of the other bikes that we see around today would exist. And its simple combination of the air-cooled engine and Fabio Taglioni's frame makes for a fantastic little road bike. The sitting position is comfortable and sensible, unlike the more racy bikes that Ducati also produce, so it is something you can actually use sensibly on a road. The Monster remains in production today, although for me some of the later water-cooled bikes lack the panache and rawness of the original design. And sales of the bike, particularly the smaller versions, remain very strong, despite stiff competition from within its own company from the Ducati Scramblers. The Vincent HRD Black Shadow. In 1928, Phil Vincent had acquired the HRD name from its failing manufacturer, Howard Raymond Davis, and would use the HRD name to try and establish the name of his new company. Initially they used Jap engines placed in their own frames, but very soon their chief engineer Phil Irvin, the mercurial Australian, went on and designed their own single-cylinder motor. The legendary story goes that Phil Irvin, whilst working in his office in the late 30s, had the blueprints of two of his Meteor engines laid over each other, and quickly realised that it could be the basis for a narrow-angle V-twin. The first 1000cc V-twin, the Series 1, was massively powerful, in fact too powerful for its gearbox components, and was, it must be said, something of a compromised design, with oil pipes just all over the place. However, the Series A did show the massive potential of the V-twin engine, and later series, which appeared after World War II, were much more refined. The Series A had produced 45 horsepower and was capable of around 110 miles an hour. The Series B, however, was much changed. The angle of the V was opened out now to a full 50 degrees. And despite running on pool petrol, which was very low octane, the machine was capable of over 100 miles an hour quite comfortably. The whole thing was placed in an all-new purpose-built chassis, which incorporated Irvin's own design of front fork and a rear suspension setup, which would be very familiar to anybody who's owned a 1980s Yamaha RD. The final Black Shadow variants were capable of 125 miles an hour from their 54 horsepower engine, and is regarded by many as the first real superbike, with tuned versions of the engine kicking out around 70 horsepower at the back wheel. The problem was that Vincent was expensive to produce, and in the period of great austerity that followed World War II, Vincent was simply not able to sell enough machines to keep the company going. In 1954, Vincent introduced the Series D. This had an all-enclosed bodywork, a truly pioneering design, but it was an absolute sales flop, and its development costs and the lack of sales would bring the company's history to an end. The Jimmy. James is a British motorcycle manufacturer which is definitely best known for its use of Villiers engines, or at least two-stroke lightweights, and while they did throughout their history produce lightweight machines, before World War II they also produced a number of single-cylinder and V-twin 500cc machines and a range of other small four-strokes also. When you consider 1920s and 1930s British V-twins, you tend to think of Jap-powered monsters with 1000cc engines. However, the Jimmy was completely different. It had a small 500cc side valve engine and was produced during the 1920s and early 30s. And for me, the great thing about these machines is it offers a taste of something slightly more exotic. Instead of the usual singles, the buyer could purchase a really nice and tiny V-twin engine, but at a price that was much more affordable than the larger bikes produced by other manufacturers. And even today it offers a modern rider a glimpse into the 1920s and 30s V-twins at a relatively affordable price. By the standards of the time, this was a smooth and very refined motorcycle. This machine was a popular sales success during its run and remains a popular choice for the classic rider today. The Moto Marini 3.5. Moto Marini began motorcycle production in 1937, and during the 50s and 60s the Bologna factory produced a range of small capacity sporty bikes such as the Satabello. However, today their best known machine is the 3.5. This 72 degree V-twin was introduced in the 1970s and was a 344cc engine, which bears some resemblance actually to the Moto Guzzi engines, having both a heron head and overhead valve actuation. Small it may have been, the little 3.5 had an excellent chassis and fantastic brakes by the standards of the time. so it's great fun even today on a twisty A road. The engine was a rev-happy little thing and didn't really produce maximum torque until around 6,000 RPM, which is very different from the Moto Guzzi offering. The bike came in essentially two flavours. There was the standard or Strada version with 35 horsepower and the 39 horsepower, at least claimed, sporty model. The problem with both these bikes is they were extremely expensive, costing as much in the UK as a CB750 Honda. In an effort to improve the mid-range torque of the engine, it was enlarged out to 500cc, but this machine was never as popular as the 3.5 and offered very little extra performance in reality. Amazingly, the bike would stay in production until the late 80s, although in various guises, including a rather ugly and unusual chopper version called the Excalibur, and a fully enclosed machine called the Dart. But none of these machines were really successful, and eventually the little Marini would fade from production. On British roads, because of their high price, not surprisingly the Marini is a fairly rare sight, was new and still is today. They do have a real cult following, so if you want to try and buy one, you best dig deep. They are surprisingly expensive for what is a relatively small and low powered little motorcycle. Honda's VTR 1000. By the mid-90s, Honda got completely fed up with their attempts to try and beat Ducati's V-twins with their V4 Honda 750, so they decided to do the obvious thing and beat them at their own game, and to that end they developed their VTR 1000. The basic F model, which was more road biased, came first, also called the Firestorm in some markets, and also the Superhawk. The Firestorm is a great motorcycle and offers a more user road friendly alternative to all those Ducati racers, but it's the much more competition oriented SP that really grabs the attention. This is a very beautiful bike, absolute stunner, and it would be the machine that would finally grab the World Superbike title for Honda. But whichever of these two bikes you go for, I think you're very unlikely to be disappointed. Brough Superior. Beautifully assembled, massively overpriced. Whatever you think of them, you cannot ignore the Brough Superior. George Brough began producing motorcycles in 1919. The machines are of course synonymous with Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, and it was on one of these machines that he would lose his life in 1935. Brough was an absolute genius in terms of marketing, and he sold each SS100 with a certificate which testified that the machine had been tested at over 100 miles an hour. Other companies at the time, such as Coventry Eagle, Zenith and New Imperial, also produced machines using the same motors and offered broadly similar performance to the Broughs. But they couldn't match Brough for sheer glamour, and the reputation of these machines is carried on through the ages. The Brough Superior is one of the most desirable machines ever built, and commands some of the highest prices of any machine ever built also. And while similar machines are available, to a Brough enthusiast, nothing else comes close. What are your all-time favourite V-twins? Are they 4-stroke or 2-stroke? Please comment below. If you enjoyed that video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.